latency jumped from 12 ms to 800 ms in 3 minutes, and the dashboard went blank. The culprit wasn't a database or backend bug. It was a single string, last, sent by the front-end pagination widget. Let's break down FastAPI path parameters and query parameters, how it works, and the exact mistake behind that failure. In this lesson, you'll learn how FastAPI handles path and query parameters, how to validate them, and how to avoid production incidents like the one you just saw. Path parameters are variable segments in the URL path, like user's userid. They identify a specific resource. Query parameters appear after the and are used for filtering, sorting, or pagination. FastAPI uses Python type hints to automatically parse, validate, and convert these parameters, returning a 422 error if the input doesn't match. Path parameters are required and identify a resource. Use path with constraints like g equals 1 to reject invalid IDs before they reach your database. For parameters that may contain slashes, use the path converter. Here's a path parameter example. Userid is declared as int with path g equals 1. If a client sends forge user 0, FastAPI returns a 422 because 0 violates the g equals 1 constraint. The second endpoint uses the path converter to capture slashes in the file path. Query parameters are optional by default. If you provide a default value, the parameter is optional. If you omit the default, it's required. FastAPI also supports multi-value query parameters using liststr. Here, query is required because it has no default. Page defaults to 1, tag defaults to none, and active defaults to true. FastAPI accepts various truthy values for booleans like yes, 1, on. A bare default like page, int equals 1 does not enforce any constraints. A client can send page equals 5 and your function receives. Use query, default equals 1, g equals 1 to enforce constraints even on the default path. For production APIs, you need more than type hints. Query lets you enforce constraints like numeric ranges, string lengths, and regex patterns. Use annotated to keep the base type visible to IDEs while attaching validation metadata. Here, servicid must match the pattern forge, $, and be at least 3 characters. Limit is optional with a default of 20, but must be between 1 and 100. Invalid input returns a 422 with a detailed error message. Regex patterns in query run on every request. An unanchored pattern like forge can cause catastrophic backtracking on adversarial input. Always anchor with and benchmark on hot paths. Declaring path parameters with specific types forces early validation. If a client sends a string where an integer is expected, FastAPI returns a 422 before your handler runs. This prevents database errors and keeps your logs clean. Here, itemid is declared as int. If a client sends items/foo, FastAPI returns a 422 with a clear error message. The handler never runs with invalid data. Pagination parameters must be bounded. Without a default limit, a client can omit it and trigger a full table scan. Use query, g equals 1, la equals 100, to enforce a cap and protect your database. Here, limit defaults to 10 and is constrained between 1 and 100. Skip must be non-negative. A request with limit equals 0 returns a 422, preventing accidental full table scans. If you omit a default for limit, the client must provide it. But if they forget, your endpoint may return all rows. Always set a default and bound it with query. This is the same issue we highlighted at the start. Here's exactly why that happened. A front-end refactor changed the pagination widget to send the string last instead of an integer page number. FastAPI correctly returned 422, but the dashboard's HTTP client treated all non-2XX as transient and retried with exponential backoff, flooding the API. The front-end pagination widget sent the string last instead of an integer page index, which FastAPI correctly rejected with 422, but the dashboard's HTTP client retried aggressively, creating thousands of 422s per second. The fix involved adding client-side input validation to guarantee page values are always integers. The HTTP client was updated to treat 422 as a permanent failure without retry. Rate limiting on 4xx responses per client IP and a circuit breaker after 3 consecutive failures prevented recurrence. Treating all 4xx errors as transient is dangerous. 422 means the client sent invalid data, retrying won't fix it. Always treat 422 as a permanent failure and avoid retries. The article uses SDR, none, Python 3.1 plus union syntax. If you target Python 3.8 or 3.9, replace with optional SDR from typing. FastAPI supports both, but the older syntax is required for compatibility with those versions. The article mentions required query parameters by omitting a default. To make a query parameter required while still using query, for validation, set default equals ellipsis. This is the idiomatic way to combine query with a required parameter. FastAPI's default behavior for duplicate query parameters is to take the last value. For list parameters, duplicates are collected. However, for scalar parameters, if a client sends page equals 1 and page equals 2, FastAPI silently uses 2. This can mask client bugs. Consider adding a custom validator to reject duplicate keys or log warnings in production. When debugging parameter issues, start by reading the 422 response body. It contains a detail array with lock, MSG, and type fields that tell you exactly what went wrong. Use curl to inspect the response and compare parameter names case-sensitively. Let's run through some common interview questions. How does FastAPI resolve param type? Checks root string for path params else query. Why prefer annotated? Keeps base type visible to IDEs and type checkers. How to capture file path with slashes? Use path converter in root. And a few frequently asked questions. What's the difference between path and query params? Path identifies resource, query modifies representation. How to make a query param required? Omit default value. Can I use regex in query params? Yes, with query pattern equals. To recap, path parameters identify resources, query parameters modify them. Type hints drive validation and documentation. Default values make parameters optional. Use annotated for clean signatures. Always bound pagination with query. And remember, 422 errors are permanent, don't retry them. Ready to go deeper? Up next, FastAPI request body and Pydantic models, then FastAPI response models and status codes, then FastAPI dependency injection. Find them all at TheCodeForge.io. Thanks for watching. The full article and code examples are covered in detail at TheCodeForge.io.